Bonsoir, bienvenue.
Hello, everyone. If you need translation, there are headsets available for translation. There are also some people away listening to us, and they'll be able to ask questions or make comments using the chat, and only through the chat, if I understood correctly. Now, let's start without further ado. Now, thank you very much, Pierre, for being with us and being ready to participate in this conference. As you could read in the invitation to this conference, Pierre Hazan is a senior advisor with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, the HD, who is in, this center is involved in mediation in armed conflicts. It's something which is not well known to a lot of people, and of course for us, it's something which is quite interesting as we are involved in armed conflict situations. And in the book he's just published, Negotiating with the Devil, and some people may have heard the program on France Culture lately about the book. So the book, Negotiating with the Devil, in this book, Pierre gives some thought to some practical attitudes in situations where you are faced with difficult area where you have to make compromise, you have to broker a deal between different parties, and not going all the way to becoming complicit to these acts, and also supporting. In the end, some groups that may hijack your mediation in order for their own benefit. Now, Pierre was a journalist and then a politician, and he went through a number of positions in the United Nations or in private or semi-public institutions involved in mediation. Transitional justice, and there's another book he wrote, which I like very much, which is entitled Judging War, Judging History, on the relationship between war crimes and justice. He's a very attentive observer of all forms of transitional justice. He's just back from Liberia. He's also someone who goes out there in the field, and he also went to Ukraine, and hopefully he will share with us his thoughts on what he saw in Liberia and Ukraine. Let me start with two situations described in this book, just by way of introduction to our discussions and to his talk. The first situation takes place during and I'm trying to avoid any confusion with another mission he was on, but the first situation is when he was as a journalist and followed an ICRC team who was trying to free prisoners from a camp where they lived in terrible conditions, some of them having lost some 20 to 30 kilograms. And they have to identify and select the people who are going to be allowed to leave the camp. Of course, something which reminds us of a sort of terrible situation in the concentration camps. And it's something that we may have seen ourselves at MSF. So they had to select the people. And in his book, he also mentions another situation whereby people had to be evacuated from Aleppo in Syria. And there was a choice to be made, and of course, a very difficult choice, and to be made to decide whether you evacuate people, leaving behind some people who are going to be to become target, and thereby contributing to a sort of redesigning of the region as planned by the Syrian regime. So these are the difficult issues on which Pierre has been pondering and describes in his book. Now, Pierre, my question to you is this one. In the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and you as a well-seasoned and well-experienced mediator, how do you envisage this sort of in-between situation between compromise and something which can't be tolerated? And how do you plan for mediation in a situation such as Ukraine, for instance? What can be the room for maneuver for mediators, for people trying to broker a deal? Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm particularly happy to be with you tonight because Crash is really one of the very rare places where people give some thought to armed conflicts. Had the opportunity to work with various organizations, and it's quite unusual to find people who really ponder on what they want to do in the difficult and borderline situations they are faced with. So let me start by saying that mediation is a very old practice, an ancient practice, and maybe we can identify three periods. It's maybe an oversimplification, but let's say the first period was dominated by the Pax Americana, with, in 1991, the Agenda for Peace by Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General at the time even contemplated the creation of a peace, of an armed force from the United Nations, and there were several situations in El Salvador, and elsewhere, and there was also this very famous bestseller, The End of History, and at the end of this period, this is where we could see the emergence of private organizations underpinned by this school of thought. However, conversely, there was another movement, another trend with an increasing involvement of justice in armed conflicts, and with the involvement of justice in real time, as it were, because, and this was, of course, quite unusual. In the past, there used to be war, and then the end of war, and then justice. Whereas now, at this time, we could see that justice and the tribunals and the courts got involved during wartime. And this we could see in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia. And this was really the tipping point with mediation becoming more and more important, and with these conflicting interests. The second period, with another domination from the United States after 9/11, with the war on terror, quote unquote. And it was quite ironical at the time, because all Security Council member states after 9/11, 2001, agreed on Resolution 1373, stating that it is no longer possible to discuss with terrorist groups, with armed groups. And this is something which serves every member state's purposes. So everybody, all member states agree. However, the European countries were faced with a very concrete difficulty. They could no longer talk to the FARC, to Hamas, to the Basque ETA, but they, at the same time, on the other hand, they had to go on discussing with these groups. So ironically, it is also what created a niche for private mediation organizations that were turned not into subcontractors, but that were able to step in on behalf of the states, because the states had tied their own hands with this resolution. And this is the second period, goes on until 2011, 2012, with Libya and Syria, 2011 with the intervention in Libya, under the pretext of having to protect people, but there were not so many people to protect at the time there. And this is what led to a showdown with Russia and with other countries as well. And this is when the Western world started to use judicial instruments with a view to protecting the people. And then Syria, the war in Syria, saw the emergence of regional powers and multilateralism. And well, gradually, the Western world becomes more and more called into question, and this creates an even bigger niche for informal brokers with these private mediation organizations. And then what is at stake for our discussions tonight? What about compromise and how to avoid compromise, that compromise turns into compromission. Compromission doesn't really exist in English, but you can use complicity or collusion or surrendering your principles and value. But this word compromission doesn't exist in English, and it's interesting. And it's, of course, something which speaks volume about the very fine line you must walk with the risk, of course, of falling and losing your balance. And this is what you were referring to, following some very strong declarations by Simone Veil, arguing that the ICR, the International Red Cross, was committing the same mistakes as during World War II. I was offered the possibility by ICRC to follow them for some weeks, and this is how I came to see these camps and go inside these camps and witness a mediation and negotiations that was to lead to the liberation of some of these 2,000 prisoners. So it's a bit like the choice of Sophie, but the other way around. I found this extremely difficult. We tried to be rational, so we went for body mass index. And this camp, which was just in Mostar, just a few kilometers away from the front line. So we sat there behind a table and with scales, and we measured and weighed these 2,000 prisoners, one after the other. So I had a feeling that I had been transformed into a bureaucrat, being asked to select people. Well, we tried to act in of course, in accordance with our conscience, and we negotiated with Pusic, someone who was specialized in the exchange of prisoners, and we knew, and this guy ended up on the bench of the ICTY, some of these people. Some of the prisoners he wanted to keep because they could be exchanged for money because they came from rich families. So we were negotiating on the basis of lists of prisoners, and the ICRC delegation split in two groups, one group arguing that there is no way you could have this sort of compromise and jeopardize your principles, and the other group in the ICRC arguing that you can't just jeopardize the lives of 600 people by arguing and sticking to your principles. And this is where I came to realize that there are some ethical lines that you may have to cross sometimes. In mediation principles, there are two aspects. One aspect is very close to what MSF does, and this has to do with humanitarian negotiations, with displacement of people, be it in Bosnia or Syria. And then there is also on the other hand, the peace process or the agreements that may be brokered for one particular reason, and this raises ethical questions. Up to what point, i.e., are the parties truly willing to negotiate, or are you used by them as an alibi, and they don't really want to broker a deal. They just want to blame the other party for failure. If you remember the situation in Sri Lanka, mediators wanted to go on with the mediation up to the bitter end, and at one point in time, the Sri Lankan government no longer wanted to negotiate and wanted to launch a radical offensive against the Tamil Tigers. So they used mediation as a sort of smoke screen in order to be able to be even more efficient with their attack. So up to what point should you go on with discussing? This also is the case with forced displacement. This was a very difficult situation for my organization at one point in time in Syria. You know, a lot of these cities were under siege by the Syrian government. So we have to participate in these negotiations that were in fact just discussions for surrender in exchange of evacuating or being able to evacuate the population, but being evacuated to another city that would become under siege or close to the Turkish border. Well, these people would be victims of airstrikes, and so up to which point did we have to go, or could we go? And after very fierce discussions internally, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue participated in a number of these exchanges. So you see all these questions, and maybe a third point, and then I leave it there. A third point is to know when the peace process is worthy of giving up some of the values you embody, be it human rights or gender equality. When do you consider that it's no longer something you can tolerate and it's no longer possible?
Ça ne suffit pas. On a besoin de réponses. Yeah, well, that's not enough. We need answers. We want to know, we're eager to know what are the answers and how do you make do with all those big questions? Well, something that has been going on for years is the peer review system. Analyzing the processes at hand, but afterwards or as a cold situation. But now we operate a bit differently. We try to debrief on the spot, and we try to destructure all the questions at hand, which we didn't used to do so much in the past. So today, the idea is to have a constant dialogue, to identify the very concrete, tangible problems at hand and to deliberate on those. I borrow from Paul Ricoeur the notion, the concept of practical wisdom. We do know that in a few days, the situation may evolve quite a bit, and what used to be unacceptable all of a sudden will become acceptable or even necessary. Hence, the moral obligation to put yourself in a situation where you can switch your views, you can change your appreciation of the situation, your analysis, and your modus operandi. Unfortunately, there is no mathematical formula to do that. Rony Brauman. Yes, well, I can guess, but from what you say, I hear sort of an invitation that MSF abides by, making deliberation a decision-making instrument when faced with tough choices. No one can imagine holding the final truth. However, questioning and deliberating over those difficulties may help you find a solution. There is one thing you touch on briefly in your book is the importance of relying on the local teams for making contacts or even for the negotiation process itself. Can you tell us more about that? Yes, a choice was made more than 10 years ago in the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, the NGO I work for, is to rely almost exclusively on the local staff at all levels almost, and that changes the dynamics quite a bit. Sometimes it is dangerous, it's risky, because those people working in very complicated negotiation processes can be badly perceived. They can be perceived as spies or as traitors by their own community. So we've had some quite severe accidents with that. And so we're really attentive to questions of security. Yes, well, some such accidents were never made public, but yes, some people disappeared altogether. We never found them in several different situations and contexts, sadly. Rony Brauman needs a microphone. Well, I'm raising the question not to embarrass you, but because it is a point of doctrine at MSF. It's our doctrine to be as public and open and transparent as possible because we're accountable to our funders. And also because it's a process of mental hygiene, as it were. It's more healthy to account for your own actions and explain to others what you do. Particularly to those who can have a fresh and new look on the situation. Well, I'll try to answer even though I don't have all the elements, but for quite a long time, the prevailing feeling was that, well, the negotiations were ongoing, so there was hope that the negotiations would lead to some positive outcome. And some families are still hoping for a good outcome. Still. So for a long time, that was it. The idea was that through diplomacy, by being very discreet, by using intermediaries, we would eventually manage to obtain their liberation. One of the person who disappeared was the son of a very religious personality. So we had hope that with the right contacts, we could get them to be released and freed. But okay, last question to you, Pierre Hazan, before taking questions from the audience. That's related to my previous question. To what extent do you think it is useful and wise and helpful to turn to a possible support from the public opinion or to use the media to launch calls or exert some pressure? And do you use that kind of leverage in a negotiation process? Pierre Hazan, there might be some exceptions, but generally speaking, I would say no. It remains pretty confidential all around. I think there are several levels in a peacemaking process. The final stage in the process is symbolized by the handshakes and pictures are taken. You see the flashes of the press cameras, but it took a lot of work upstream before that open handshaking. And the periods before that are often borne by organizations such as the UN or regional organizations such as the African Union or by states, and this is public. But private mediation organizations intervene more upstream in the initial and most complicated part. It's highly confidential. And very few people, including among the parties involved, very few people are informed that some contacts have been made. That's why when we turn to the public opinion, it's only much later, after the ripening process of the peacemaking process, and once it became public. And then it actually becomes very important. Otherwise, there might be a deal being struck between some elites, meaning there will be quite a number of spoilers. That's the danger. So the deal between the elites has to rest on the buying in by the rest of the society. Okay, Rony Brauman, if I get it right, the success of a mediation process, well, all the credit is for the belligerents, right? They're the ones being congratulated, and you withdraw. You remain behind the wings very modestly. Well, it's only right, because the belligerents, they were the ones who fought, and you have to pay a high price for that deal. For families who lost lots of people, who lost their relatives, the missing people, the prisoners. It's a high price to pay, so it's certainly normal. It takes so many conditions for a peacemaking process to have a successful outcome. And nowadays, we're in a world that's drastically different from what the world was 10 or 20 years ago. We were talking about Ukraine, and I'm struck by the very punctual agreements that were made. I hear quite a fascinating debate going on in France, for example, currently. It's very emotional as well, this debate, between those who consider you cannot talk with the devil, namely Putin, but we do acknowledge that there would have been a famine in several countries if an agreement over the cereals were not made. And it's thanks to that there are some exchanges of prisoners. It's not fully satisfying. It's just a transactional agreement. It's not a peace process per se. It's like between Lebanon and Israel, the two countries agreed on their maritime border, even though technically speaking they're at war. And when the main military force, the Hezbollah, is qualified by the USA and by Israel, is qualified as a terrorist organization, but it's not a problem when it comes to gas exploration. So mediation is becoming widespread because we're in a very globalized world, but with bigger and bigger gaps and divides. A lot of work still remains to be achieved. Rony Brauman. A last question, for good this time. It's a question about the method. A mediation and transaction organism, a mediator as yourself or your organization, do you consider that those punctual points of negotiation, like an exchange of prisoners, which is quite restricted compared with the magnitude of the conflict, or an agreement on the export of cereals, like what happened in Ukraine, or an agreement on fertilizers, that has to take place, otherwise there are high risks of very bad harvests and famine. Is that considered as just one step towards a final resolution of a conflict, or is it only a stay of execution, a little better, like addressing, like humanitarian action itself? It doesn't aim at solving the big global problems, but just mitigating the most severe consequences. Sadly, I believe, Pierre Hazan, sadly, I believe it's the second option. It's just a little alleviation. All right. That's clear. Okay, time for questions now. Thank you for this great presentation. I work on conflicts in Africa, in countries like Uganda and Mali. There is a host of private actors of mediation who were very much criticized. They were blamed for annihilating the peace efforts deployed by the governments. Is that a risk, and is that like a competition on the market, as it were? And my second question, the relationship between the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, your NGO, and the ICRC. In the 70s, there were ICRC delegates who, on an individual basis, would carry out negotiations to free some hostages. But it's not their core business or their core mission. And it's like the ICRC cut off its mediation branch, which was highly political. Do you confirm that? Did the ICRC play a key role, crucial role in creating this Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is based in Geneva as well? I would have many more questions, but I want to give time for others. Pierre Hazan, thank you. Those are very good questions. I'll talk about Mali more than Uganda, that I don't know as much. What's interesting about Mali is that we had the 2015 peace agreements. the peace agreement itself is quite surprising, actually, when you look at it. What happened? There were lots of armed groups from the north, and at some point there was an alliance between the independentist armed group for Azawad and the jihadist armed groups. So the question arose concerning the mediation. The leader for mediation was Algeria, with the United Nations behind and others. Who should sit around the table? And when both armed groups used the same techniques, they decided to discard the Islamists and to talk with the independentists only. So at the end of the day, this 2015 agreement for peace and reconciliation in Mali just gave rise to more and more violence. It was a total fiasco, total failure. The populations were not aware of it, and it was Algeria who imposed by force, almost, a peace agreement that didn't give any result. So the international community as a whole, because you had Algeria, but many other actors, were handicapped by the local agreements. Then another question was that in the Sahel region, Saharan region, you have dozens or hundreds of conflicts between semi-nomad breeders and sedentary farmers. Historically, you always had tensions, but some corridors were agreed on almost officially. Now, with the demographic explosion and even with the climate change, it was no longer possible. And the breeders now tend to go more south and on the land of the farmers. And this gives rise to conflicts, and it was instrumentalized by the jihadists. Hence the idea of having micro local agreements. And that's when the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, but also other NGOs, worked on those local agreements between the nomads and the breeders, making it possible for the social and economic life to resume, but it remains fragile. If you can have an agreement between A and B, it may hold up, but it calls for the seal of like a prefect dispatched by the government. The major jihadist group have to give their blessing as well, but often those agreements can be undermined when a group from outside comes into play, jeopardizing the agreement that was made. But generally speaking, out of all the agreements struck under the auspices of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, several hundreds are holding up, 400, I believe, but many others failed. So it's a limited and punctual one-shot contribution. It doesn't give rise to a global or all-encompassing solution. The Sahelian societies will have to make a choice, between their jihadist model or an authoritarian model or a model derived from colonization. It's up for them to decide. As to the second question, what happened was that the Henri Dunant Center, historically linked to the ICRC, was the result of an agreement between ICRC, the Swiss Red Cross, and the Federation of Red Cross Societies. It was like a retirement home for delegates who had traveled extensively. I hope not too many people from the Red Cross are listening. And at some point, they felt it was not really efficient anymore. Hence the idea of doing something else. During a very brief period, we discussed that one day, Rony. It lasted a few months. The idea was to make it a place for informal discussions between humanitarian agencies. And then finally, the concept was totally revised. It was changed, and it became an organization for mediation in armed conflicts. And then they said, okay, we have nothing to do with you. We don't know you because you're into politics and we're not. That being said, you know, in the field, all the parties stuck to each other, but officially there is no contact.
Bonsoir, merci, je suis Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. You referred to justice and tribunals that have now become part of the conflict areas. So it's a bit difficult to refer to justice per se. So in your view, in what way has the involvement of justice in armed conflicts can become an obstacle to mediation or some sort of transactional instrument for mediation? Politicians are always tempted to hijack international courts or justice. And in WikiLeaks, you could see that in some instances. The British government in particular were ready for the prosecutor to drop charges against Omar al-Bashir in Sudan in exchange for Omar al-Bashir resigning. Likewise with Charles Taylor. And it's an interesting story what happened with Charles Taylor. For many years, the United Nations tried to set up a peace conference. They eventually managed to do so, and there were 4 African heads of state, and Charles Taylor went to Ghana to participate in the peace process, and climbing up the stairs at this very moment, the prosecutor for Sierra Leone disclosed the indictment of Charles Taylor for his crimes, and obviously the peace process collapsed. Interestingly, in the first stage, there was a negotiation, and Charles Taylor was told, you'll never go to jail, provided you resign and you go on holiday in Nigeria. This is what he did. And he was told, just forget about your country, don't get involved. But he went on, and this is how he was arrested and was tried. And I think he's still in prison in the UK. And so you see, coming back to your question, the mediation space is rendered more difficult when there are indictments or charges. This brings to mind the ceasefire in Libya. And one of the important stakeholders was persecuted, but we had to have him participate in the discussion. So some means had to be found so that this person could travel and participate in a process that eventually gave rise to ceasefire in Libya. And as an anecdote, I think the charges against him have been dropped now. Fabrice, Crash, 2 questions. You were giving the example of negotiations between farmers and cattle breeders. How can you manage to sit at the same table as these people coming from Geneva? And is it peace at all costs, provided it puts an end to war? Your first question is about how you get involved in negotiations when you come from far away. Well, provided your teams are local teams. And this is really what is essential for a mediation organization, is to identify the key persons, people who are going to give you direct access to armed groups, to the army, to the government, to all people carrying firearms and having an influential people. So you really have to identify these key people, and this is how you get invited to the negotiation table. And of course, these local people are very familiar with their communities. And so there's some sort of mapping of teams with limited number of people who can give you access to the right contacts, the right contact persons for the peace process, for the negotiation, and more particularly in Sahel. So these are members from these communities, and these community members discuss with the others, participate in the mediation process. And this is where the cultural dimension comes into play. In some cases, in some discussions, there may be as many as 300 people discussing about how to access the well for water, also how the cattle is going to be handed back to the cattle breeders, and so on and so forth. Now, peace at all costs. Now, of course, there are some lines you don't want to cross. You don't want to become an accomplice. And this is why there are some borderline cases. And in borderline cases, these are the cases where there are forced displacements of people, like in Syria, where things were very complicated. And without disclosing any secret here, our team was of different opinions, of mixed opinions. Some people among us thought that there was no possibility of a political solution, and that there was no way we could guarantee these people's safety. Others who still, having Bosnia in mind, thought that it was, and we could see that people, whenever there were coaches, buses available, they were running for the buses, running for the coaches. So they were voting with their feet, as it were, knowing very well that it wasn't an ideal solution, but they were ready to run the risk of leaving rather than taking the risk of remaining in their cities. Good evening. My name is Morgan. My question is this one. It's about the humanitarian negotiations conducted by NGOs when they want to access a field. Can these NGOs have detrimental impact on peace negotiations? Did this happen, or do you think it's something that could happen? Because we as an NGO, we of course try to get access to some fields for humanitarian action, but can it be something that has a negative impact on peace negotiations or mediation? I can't really figure out how this could happen. I can well imagine that in some cases, and the biggest risk, in fact, is to be perceived as taking sides, or being perceived as being just as an organization that embodies the United Nations or the international community or a donor. And this is where you want to be very clear about this. And this may be also in link with Fabrice's question. You see, sometimes you wear two hats, or there are two mandates. You want the armed groups, the parties to the conflict, to accept your role, but you need also to get some cash in your accounts. And some of these donors, at 80% of them, are European governments. And of course, one of the first things we do is to state very clearly who are our donors. Like in Sahel, we were very selective with our donors. We didn't want to get money, any money from former colonial states, for instance. My name is Stéphane. I have a question on a very important point you mentioned. You said that depending on the process you select, peace negotiation, peace mediation can be very lengthy, like in Somalia or the Horn of Africa. In Somaliland, the peace process took several years. At the end of the day, do you think that this is what allowed the peace to be restored? This is a good question. I was involved in the Basque Country conflict, and it took some 10 years and lots of efforts. And well, eventually one day we were able to reap the fruit of all these efforts. When can you say that it's enough? There's nothing else you can do? I think it's you can do so by assessing how willing the different parties to the conflict are to reach peace. For instance, in process like in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, you can be very close to a deal, and then there can be a terror attack, and it stops everything. It happened in Ireland, Northern Ireland, but they went on with the peace process. But in the Basque Country, well, there was an attack, and it put the negotiations on hold, and it took several years for these different parties to come back to the table. So I think it's also something that depends on how motivated the donors are. And there's also the risk of being victim of manipulation at one point in time. And something comes to mind. It's quite dramatic. I can remember a Swedish businessman, very influential. He was very close to the KPD in the UK in 1939, and he was also a close friend of Goering, number 2, number 3 in the Reich. And Goering was feeding him false information, and he was just the postman delivering the information. And on the very day when war was declared, he had some peace proposals he wanted to hand over to the embassy, to the ministry in Berlin. So there's always this risk of being manipulated. So you have to use your best judgment. My name is Jean-François. You referred to Aleppo and the displacement of people who were likely to be also under siege in other cities and victims of airstrikes. How can you also make the difference between civilians and members of armed groups. It's always very difficult, and of course, in families there might be people who are involved in the conflict. And when you told us that you felt as a bureaucrat, like in Mostar camp, how did you work out the selection using medical criteria? Are there any diseases that you took into account or you take into account? Do you have doctors, healthcare professionals who work with you? Can you use medical diseases to scare off the some of the negotiators, some of the parties, so that you can have people out of the camps a bit more quickly? So how do you and can you use health as a negotiating tool? There has been some review about the about some of the deals, and a lot of intermediaries, a lot of go-betweens were involved, including Iranian or Qatari ambassadors. And what we can see is that what in fact matters is the power play. In fact, if the party under siege is weak and perceived as very weak, well, the more difficult it is to evacuate people. And combatants, jihadist combatants, in some cases left with their arms, with their weapons, and there was no discrimination between fighters and non-fighters. And I think in all cases, in fact, there were no discrimination between fighters and non-fighters. So it's mainly the power balance that dictates the conditions, the terms of the deal. When I was with the humanitarian team, I was as embedded. So there was a doctor with a team, and this doctor who had no experience of humanitarian medicine. He was some 50 years old, and I thought he was very old at the time. Fresh out of a divorce and procedure, and he had done his career in the chemical industry in Basel. And he kept saying, I don't want to be Dr. Mengele. And he's the one who came up with the idea of the body mass index. And this is how we proceeded. At the end of the day, this is what we did. Marion. How do you define your scope, your terms of reference? Do you have objectives, and how do you react when there are other initiatives? Perhaps there are other mediators in some cases, non-Western mediators, or how do you work or with that? I'll start with the last part of your question. Yes, the world of mediation is now quite crowded, and mediation is a word that is ambiguous, so it opens up a wide field. You have some people who are acting on their own, and others work within communities. Some of them, or some who try to use track one. The Center for Humanitarian Dialogue usually tries to work with the elite, with with the high officials in Sahel. All our teams are local staff up to the regional director level. We also cooperate with organizations and local associations of Mali or Nigeria or else. So this can be complementary or it can be like a competition. And sometimes it's quite tragic because this competition can be also a competition between NGOs or between donor states, each trying to position itself, like Norway and Switzerland could be partners, but could be competitors. And if they fund different NGOs, you could have some repercussions in the field.
That being said, for a number of years, there have been several meetings between the main mediation organizations to avoid duplication, redundancies, and to streamline and rationalize the work of mediation and avoid silly, absurd competition. Good evening, Michael. We talked of a mandate several times. It happens that humanitarian organizations are questioned about their legitimacy to act. So, mediation organizations, how do they reflect on the legitimacy they have to act, particularly towards or with the local populations or leaders? And how can you make sure that they work on behalf and according to the will and wishes of the local population? In other words, you act on behalf of what and whom as a mediator? Pierre Hazan. Well, the mandate is negotiated between the parties that are bearing arms and the donor states. Then it's about taking into account all the parameters so that the deal can hopefully be successful. So the role of civil society is necessarily taken on board. But then, technically speaking, to what extent can you change the configuration around the table? A simple example, what happened in Colombia and the negotiations in Cuba. At some point, the most complicated stake was the questions of justice, and the FARC and the Colombian government could not agree. And eventually, with the advice of the Norwegians and the Cubans, they accepted to bring in 60 victims, 5 groups of 12 people, each of them representing the spectrum of all the victims. And those 5 successive encounters and meetings made it possible to find an agreement on questions having to do with justice. That's incredibly complicated, but it was a most interesting agreement. There was the idea of an exceptional jurisdiction so that people who committed war crimes but recognized their war crimes would be sentenced to 8 years, up to 8 years, not of jail, but working in the interest of the public, of the country. However, if they did not confess, then they could be sentenced to up to 20 years of prison. There are also processes of non-penal and transitional justice, like a justice aiming at repairing, that were set up. Just to say that at some point it might be necessary to bring on board people from civil society to find an outcome to a situation. It can even be an entry point. Like civil societies, opposite civil societies can have common interests. I have in mind what happened with Kosovo and Serbia. One of the stakes for the civil societies was the fate of the missing people. So against the government of Pristina and the government of Belgrade, both societies, both civil societies, were ready to work together. So you could have some leverage to find an outlet to the situation and to go further into finding a solution. So when we're asked to intervene, it's often about identifying where the right entry point is. Rony Brauman, I'd like to ask you about something that disturbs me a bit. I have in mind the, when thinking about the history of MSF and the beginnings of MSF, when MSF was practically unknown beyond the French borders, the presentation was sort of a mix between something inspired from the Red Cross and a professional medical service that everybody could understand in a Red Cross spirit. And I say that because I do remember the presentation of MSF I would do to local leaders or local authorities. This was some kind of legitimacy that was easily readable. But you don't do that because people know exactly who you are. Well, people know that it's about getting people to meet, to get together, but we don't know what constraints or pressures you're under. So how did you build or construct your legitimacy? When I commented that modest withdrawal at the time of the public conclusion of an agreement, I had that in mind as well, because the media are there not only to publicize your action, but also to build your public image so you can be useful somewhere else. Now, you're waiving that possibility for reasons that I do understand, but then what makes it so that people do heed what you have to say, do listen to you, people who are in a context of a conflict and who don't believe in nothing really much except the use of force? What makes you credible and legitimate? Pierre Hazan, you have two types of mediators. You have the powerful and strong ones, like the USA, like the example of Dayton. You start by bombarding, and then you invite all the actors to a military base, and, that's one way of doing it. Yeah, it's clear, indeed, clear cut. And then you have those who don't have neither the stick nor the carrot. It's the table negotiator. It's the private negotiator. So what's the point? First, it's very reassuring for government to deal with a private negotiator. It's not a government or the United Nations. It's someone who does not exist, really. So it's reassuring. You very much want to know what the other party wants. And if you have to go through people who practically don't exist, sort of ghosts, well, let's use them. It's reassuring, after all. Now, for the armed group sees some perspective. Okay, I'm not given the recognition I'd love to have, but those people are in touch with the donors, with pretty much all the states. So if I do talk with them, I have some prospect of, in the near future, to get in touch with so-and-so that I really want to get in touch with. That's our role. So it's the absence of danger that's really reassuring because you're nobody. I remember somebody explaining to a head of state, you can kick us out tomorrow, so you have no problem with us. But let us work, and you'll see if in 6 months, 1 year from now, you don't see any concrete result, fine. We'll draw the consequences of that. Now, that's the situation when you act in a situation of conflict where the international community does not intervene. Now, when the international community intervenes, like through a resolution by the African Union or the United Nations, then you have an official mandate and you have to tick some boxes, whether it is DDR or transitional justice, political dialogue. You do need some expertise and things that are very concrete and tangible. So there is a tangible interest of the international community and the parties to be as equipped as possible. Like a situation where you have armed groups who are not used to negotiate on very highly technical questions with high strategic stakes, it's essential to have the right training for that and the right information. I'll talk about some examples, such as questions of justice or amnesty. What is an amnesty? An amnesty can be conditional or not conditional, unconditional. You have to be able to understand strategically how far it can go, what are the potential dangers for each side, and, you know, it can be even more technical. My name is Nicolas. In connection with those questions, what type of training are there for a mediator, both in your center? Maybe you have a recruitment policy or a given mediator profile. And then what kind of training or what kind of experience do you need in connection with that question of legitimacy? Is it psychology or legal questions or journalism, the kind of training people need? Legal experts, what is the ideal profile of mediators? Well, I can't talk about other organizations because I don't know them that well. In my organization, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, we have a staff of some 400 people. Most of them work in the field, and most of them were chosen on the basis of their competence to access a situation. I worked extensively in the region of Difa in Niger, and we tried to identify the people who were the most familiar with the local communities. That's one thing, local knowledge. And then you also wanted those people to have an access to the armed groups and to the government. That's the kind of profile we look for. You know, it's people who are good on the field that we need. Today, there are lots of young people who are program officer or project officer. They did study mediation because today you have masters in mediation, international relations, diploma, but their number is small, actually. We mainly need people who are experienced and know the field. Good morning. My name is Marie, or Mary. I'm a legal expert. At what point does your mandate stop? Is it at the moment the peace is signed, or if we talk of transitional justice, will you take part in the implementation of these mechanisms and continue promoting the dialogue? Pierre Hazan. Well, I did study law extensively as well. But the bulk of the work stops with the conclusion, with the signing of the peace agreement. There is a Western fetishism about a piece of paper, and it's problematic in other conflicts, in other situations, precisely where how people relate to a peace treaty is totally different from the way we view it. And then about transitional justice mechanisms, I might be the only one, or there are very few of us working on that in our organization, in our NGO, because for a long time they were very defiant about anything having to do with notions of justice. And then there are many organizations that like ICTJ, working on questions of justice, and they're specialized in transitional justice, for example. Good morning, or good evening. My name is Claire. We do lots of negotiations for access with many kinds of groups, and often we're blamed for, or we are accused of fueling war. All the parties involved accuse us of fueling the war by working in both camps. And we talk to the same actors. So between access and negotiations granted for humanitarian actors and the contacts you have to entertain, well, it's hard for me to answer. I was never really in that situation. Well, granted, the risk is that you might have other mediation organizations doing the same thing. So there might be some silly competition between several NGOs, but between MSF and a mediation organization, no, it's quite different. Negotiating for humanitarian access is one thing. I think it's complementary more than a competition. Two questions from the chat. One about the way you work. You mentioned internal agreements in some situations. Disagreements in some situations. How do you overcome these disagreements? Second, when you use local contacts, how do you guarantee their security, particularly in the event of ethnical conflicts? Pierre Hazan. Well, I'm not sure we did find a solution. When the disagreements are really deep, everyone drew their own conclusions, and well, from some experiences, on the contrary, I would say we derived from that our will to implement procedures that help us with debriefing and peer reviewing. That's the lessons we drew mainly. And about the security of our contacts, for a long time we were a bit too light with that. And some tragic events showed us otherwise, and we changed our procedures. We became more cautious. And now we appoint one person in charge of security. That's new. And we are aware of those risks. But like with MSF, there is no zero risk. I don't know how you view that. But since our staff is local at all levels and in the field, yes, our personnel may be quite exposed. Hence, the need to be in close contact with all the parties to make sure that we are well received. Hence, the need to maintain frequent contacts with the whole spectrum of the parties in conflict. That's one possible approach. And also, we must keep our ears open.
You were saying something about your donors and the major donors. What is your accountability? Do you think it's something that can be a constraint for you, a limitation, this level of accountability? Now, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue was created 20 years ago. So gradually there was a better understanding and also some consensus and confidence. And we have regular briefings and communications, and it so happens that donors are very keen on hearing what we have to say. They need to understand better what goes on in the field, in complicated areas, so much so that gradually you can sort of adjust the mandate, the terms of reference, depending on the evolution in the field. So you just adapt yourselves to political and military reality, and you adapt yourselves as best as possible. And this is something you get the message across to your donors, that in our case are a majority of European countries. Now, we don't really rely on American funds. In one case, only one case I can remember of, we had the authorization by the American donor to discuss with a group considered as terrorist. Francesco, my question: what about the risk-taking for national staff? Here I'd like to qualify this question, because we tend to use profiling in our case at MSF. Do you also resort to profiling in your center? Because, of course, it's very useful to have someone who is local and well-known. However, this can entail more risk for the person, because it is thought that the risk level does vary depending on your origin, the color of your skin, or your gender, or your ethnic origin. And this is why we don't send some people like Americans or French people to some fields, because their risk exposure could be higher, which means, of course, that the risk is transferred to other people who have to step in instead. Well, our teams are almost exclusively local staff, and we do send some expats, obviously, and there are some exceptions to the rule. However, our teams are usually local teams. Of course, at the end of the day, there's still a level of risk. And is it worthwhile to take some risks to meet some of these people? Or is it safe to send someone? So these are acute and critical questions. I must confess that I've never been involved in security matters, so it's a bit difficult for me to tell you more about this. Lise, here's my question. What about the risk of being instrumentalized, of being, when you take part in a peace process, in a mediation? I'm sure I'm going to be able to quote Rony, and I'll stand corrected by him, obviously. I think there's a difference between manipulation and being instrumented. Of course, if we are not useful, no one will want to have us. And if you are useful, well, you might be used to certain ends. Now, does this mean that you are going to serve the purposes of one party versus the other parties? Well, this is where you have to see whether it's meaningful or not. Whether, in some cases, it means that you'll have to say no, because that would mean leaving the door too much open to one country or one state that would like to look good and that would use this to its own for its own benefit. So this is the risk of manipulation. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I ask myself the same questions, and there are, books, libraries are full of books on the just war, but there's not much on mediation and compromise and jeopardizing your own values and principles, compromission, as we say in French. Yeah, you've been extremely disciplined, and I think we ran out of question. And those of you who are expecting my conclusion, well, I leave you coming up with your own conclusions in your minds. I will leave you to meditate on what Pierre has told us, and so we'll leave it there, and we'll have some drinks together if you so wish.